This evening I want to talk to you about a subject which is very, very close to my heart. It's an issue which I think is impacting our society in ways that we don't fully understand. An issue that is very, very prevalent in the corporate world, and an area that I really want to get after and work on, which is how do we go about breaking the stigma linked to depression and anxiety, with a particular focus on the corporate world. I have a view that the corporate world is probably still the biggest bastion of stigma that exists in our society. And I'm very, very grateful for a number of celebrities, politicians, and sportsmen who've raised the awareness of mental health in our society. But where we're not seeing enough work is in the corporate world. And it's the corporate world which I think is where most of the stigma exists. And most of us spend most of our time working, and this issue of mental health is having a huge impact. Now, there are all sorts of reasons as to why I can be passionate about this issue. I mean, the first reason could be that after spending 26 years in an organization called Unilever, with my final role being the global head of HR for all our communications, sustainability, and marketing, I could come at this issue from a very strong business case. And there is a strong business case for why we should begin to address the mental health in the working world. Earlier this year, Paul Farmer and his team put out a report which has shown that mental health is costing the UK economy close to £105 billion a year. We also know from a number of research papers that had been done by the Corporate Leadership Council and others that back in 2014, mental health, just mental health, was costing the UK economy in areas around depression and anxiety close to 16 billion euros a year. Depression and anxiety, as a result of absenteeism and presenteeism with respect to people at work. We also know that suicide is the leading cause of death amongst men between the ages of 28 and 45 in a country like the UK. Suicide is the leading cause of death. And so I think there is very clearly a business case. There was recently an article from a particular organization in this country which showed that 25% of their costs around absence were as a result of depression and anxiety. And I could go on to talk about the business case for this, but I actually don't come at this from a business case point of view. I'm driven by a deep desire and passion to address this issue because of my own crucible moment that I had in life. I'll never forget the night. It was the 25th of January, 2008. I woke up at midnight with a panic attack. Now, I had never, ever experienced a panic attack in my life. And the reason I remember the date so clearly is because the 26th of January is one of my daughter's birthdays. And I remember Jennifer saying to me, "Dad, on the 26th, please come down to the bowling alley and do some bowling with my friends as part of my birthday." And I lasted 15 minutes. That panic attack, that night, was my crucible moment. I lay in bed thinking that I was about to have a heart attack. I had no idea what was happening to me. I bumped Debbie, my wife, and I said, "Deb, I think I'm going to have a heart attack. I'm about to die." She said, "Why?" I said, "I can't breathe." I said, "My heart is beating. I think I'm going to have a heart attack." And at this stage, we'd been married for about 23 years, and she turned over and said, "We'll have it." No. She said, Geoff, get up, have a walk around, and see if it subsides. So I got up, I walked around, and slowly I calmed myself down. I got back into bed. And from that day onwards, for about 3 months, I never ever slept beyond 3 o'clock in the morning. The next morning I went to the doctor, and I said to the doctor, there's something wrong with me. I had this panic attack. And so the doctor, he asked me a number of questions. And I'll never forget the questions that he asked me. And they were along the lines of, he asked me, what's your appetite like, Geoff? And I said to him, it's funny you asked that, but over the last 6 or 7 months, I've probably lost 8 kgs. I've got no appetite. He then said to me, so your energy levels, what are they like? And I said, I haven't got any energy. I mean, I love getting on a bicycle, going for a ride, either on my road bike or my mountain bike. And for 3 months, I hadn't been able to even get on a bicycle. That's how little energy I had. He said, what's your sleep like? And I said, you know, I can fall asleep. But then at about 3 o'clock in the morning, or 4 o'clock, I'll wake up and I will ruminate and ruminate and ruminate over the same issue. He said, what are you reading, Geoff? And I said, you know, funny you asked that question. I've stopped reading, in particular, newspapers. And he said, why newspapers? And I said, I cannot read anything negative in a newspaper. If I have to read something about a child dying or a parent dying or anything that is sad, it just triggers me like you won't believe. So I've stopped reading a newspaper. He said, what about your social life? I said, you know, I mean, I have a saying, the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. And in many ways, people would have described me as somebody who just brings light to people's lives. But I couldn't socialize with anybody anymore. I didn't want to see people. I just wanted to be a hermit. Just be on my own and not engage and do things with friends and family. And I used the example of not even being able to go and do some 10-pin bowling with my daughter the night before. And then he asked me a question which I really thought very, very hard about whether I would answer it honestly. And the question that he asked me was, have you had any suicidal thoughts? And you know, if we think depression and anxiety has got a stigma to it, suicide has got an even bigger stigma. And I reflected and I thought, I'm going to be honest and I'm going to answer him. And what I said to him is yes. And then he said, have you planned it? And I said, I haven't planned it, but I've thought of different options of taking my life. He said, how often do you think about that? I said, I probably think about it 2 or 3 times a day. He said, Geoff, you're sick. I said, what? What? Sick with what? I mean, I don't feel sick. He said, you're ill. I said, I'm ill with what? I said, I haven't got a cold, I haven't got a temperature, I haven't got a headache. He said, you're ill. I said, tell me, what am I ill with? He said, if general anxiety disorder is a 0 on a scale of 0, with general anxiety disorder being a 0, and manic depression is a 10, he said, Geoff, I think you're a 4. Now, my understanding of the word depression was probably and best manifests itself by comments I used to make about depression. For example, because I'm a keen cyclist, if I woke up on a Saturday morning and it was pouring with rain, I'd turn to Debbie and say, oh, I'm depressed that it's raining, I can't go for a ride. Or if the English beat us in rugby, I'd say, I'm depressed because we can't even beat the English in a game of rugby. my understanding of the word depression has changed significantly. Before I left that doctor's room, I made a decision that I think has saved my life. And I think the decision that I made has saved my life to such an extent that had I not made that decision, I'm not sure I'd be here today talking to you. And the decision that I made as I walked out of the doctor's room was not to be burdened by the stigma associated with depression. Now, in some ways, I was really lucky because I, at that stage, had 20 years with Unilever. I was in a very senior job. I didn't have to climb the corporate ladder anymore. And I worked for a company that truly cared. And so telling my employer was not that difficult. But I was absolutely frightened of telling my friends and my family. Why? Because 1, I felt ashamed. 2, I felt embarrassed. 3, I thought, what are these people going to think of me? Here's Geoff McDonald. Of all people we wouldn't think would suffer from depression. And I don't tell you this story with any arrogance, but up until that stage, there I was, doing a global role in the business, traveling the world, being successful in my career. On top of that, trying to be a father, trying to be a good husband. On top of that, over a 20-year period, running 40 marathons, 2 half Ironmen. And then guess what? This macho guy has his crucible moment in life. Maybe that helps you understand why I felt ashamed, embarrassed, and scared to tell my family and my friends. But I did it. And it saved my life. I'll tell you why it saved my life. Because I got all the love, I got all the support, and I got all the encouragement from those people to get better. And so over a period of about 3 months, I got myself better with a combination of medication, cognitive behavioral therapy, slowly getting back onto my bicycle, and probably the most powerful part of my recovery was I used to meet with a guy every 2 weeks, a colleague of mine in Unilever who 2 years prior had been so ill with depression that he was admitted to hospital. And I used to meet with Martin every 2 weeks, and I used to see somebody who was well and healthy. And guess what it gave me? It gave me hope. It gave me that little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, which said to me, because I knew how ill he was 2 years before, and now I saw him better. It just gave me that little bit of hope that this can pass and that I can get better. And so over a 3-month period with that kind of intervention, I eventually got myself somewhat better, and I began to reintegrate myself back into Unilever. And then, this is now 2008. In October of 2012, you might recall that there were a spate of bankers that jumped off buildings in the city. There were 4. In fact, it was in the Standard just the other night. One of those was a very, very good friend of mine. And when Nico took his life that afternoon, nobody could believe it. Talk about the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. Here was a guy who brought light to everybody's life. And now he was dead. And I lay in bed that night and I thought to myself, at a very simplistic level, I thought to myself, stigma has killed a friend of mine. Because if Nico had been able to share what he was going through, he might be with us today. And not even I, who'd been ill in 2008, who then had a relapse in 2010, nothing as bad as 2008, but not even me recognized the symptoms in Nico. Why? Because he mastered so well. He mastered so well. And the research is absolutely clear with depression and anxiety. The sooner you intervene in the illness, the greater the chance there is of some form of recovery. The longer you leave it, the greater the chance that the individual will take their own life. And as I lay in bed that night, I thought, I have to do something about this. Stigma has killed a friend. But I didn't know where to start. Here I am, a South African living in London. How am I going to contribute at a UK level? All my mates are South Africans. My network is all inside Unilever, because at that stage I've had about 23 years with Unilever. And so I think to myself, there's one person out there who's doing an enormous amount of work in advocating and campaigning in this space. I'm going to go onto his website and I'm just going to see if there's an email address, and I'll send him an email, because he might be able to open some doors for me. So I Google this individual, up comes his website, there's an email address, and I think, right, I'm going to write to him. And so I write him an email, and in that email I tell him what happened to me back in 2008, and how the decision to not be burdened by the stigma, I think, has helped to save my life and keep me alive. And that this afternoon I've just lost a very good friend. Please, could he meet with me to help me play a role in addressing the stigma linked with depression and anxiety? That person was Alistair Campbell. Alistair Campbell was Tony Blair's communications director. I'd known that Alistair was doing an enormous amount of work in the space, and I thought that the email would go into the delete folder, because who's the stranger? Geoff McDonald. Within 10 minutes he'd responded, and a week later we met up in North London, and ever since that day, back in 2012, he has helped and opened all sorts of doors for me to advocate and campaign, including a number of programs that I've done on radio with the BBC, with Tim Samuels on Radio 5, Men's Hour, the Listening Project. I've written for the Huffington Post, the Financial Times. And I was doing all of this stuff, and then I kind of thought to myself, you know where you can have the biggest influence, Geoff, on this issue? Is in the company you work for. That's where you could have a huge influence. And so I thought, well, maybe that's what I should do. And I remember going and talking with the head of HR in our UK business, and we looked at some of our absenteeism numbers around long-term absence, and we kind of thought, hey, we think there could be an issue in our own organization. And you know, charity often starts at home. And so Tim and I, we decided that we needed to try and get after the stigma associated with depression and anxiety. Because in Unilever we had everything in terms of support materials. We had cognitive behavioral therapists on site. We had employee assistance programs. We had helplines to the Samaritans. We had a great occupational health function, but guess what? Nobody used it when it came to depression or anxiety. Why? Because of the stigma. And so what we decided to do was to just go on a holiday around around support. Just go on a holiday around support. And to focus upstream around breaking the stigma. It needed CEO support to do that. Not many people wanted to go and talk to the CEO about this issue. And so what I did was I asked Alistair Campbell to come in and do a talk in Unilever. And so Alistair comes in one evening. He says to me, Geoff, I'm giving you an hour and a half. He comes in at 4 o'clock. He delivers his talk in our canteen up on the top floor of the Unilever head office in Victoria Embankment. And I think at about 6:30 or 7, he eventually leaves the building. The place is full, and he tells his own story of how depression and anxiety and the impact that it's had on his life. And at the end of that talk, he walks out of the building and he tweets to his 250,000 followers at that time what an amazing afternoon he's just had in Unilever, talking about not stress, not burnout, depression and anxiety. Because you see, stress in many ways is a good thing. Stress can lead to action. And so stress is kind of a nice word to use as a cover-up to what you might be really feeling, which is really ill with depression or anxiety. But it's okay to use the word stress. It's when we have too much stress and we become distressed that leads to depression and anxiety. And Alistair tweets this, and I see this tweet and I think, wow, I'm going to send that to the CEO. So I send it to Paul. Paul sends the tweet to Ariana Huffington. Because that year in Davos, her session around Thrive, her book, and mindfulness was one of the most oversubscribed sessions at Davos. Paul sends the tweet to Ariana. Ariana then writes back to Paul and says, if you're doing such amazing work around depression and anxiety in Unilever, write an article for the Huffington Post about what you're doing. Paul asks me to help him, and I say to him, Paul, we're doing very little, so I don't know what we're going to write. And ever since that day, he became the biggest supporter of a piece of work led by Tim Munden, our head of HR in the UK, and myself, where we went after stigma. And what did we do? We did two very simple things. The first thing that we did was we educated our employees around what is depression and what is anxiety. Do you know, in many ways, I wish somebody had educated me around those illnesses. I had physical education at school. Nobody gave me any mental education. My mother and father, they taught me dental hygiene. And guess what? My teeth haven't fallen out. I wish somebody had given me some mental hygiene. Maybe I would have never got ill in the first place. And so what we did was we ran an education program which helped people understand that depression and anxiety are illnesses like any other illness. It's just that it impacts your mind. What are the symptoms to look out for in yourself and the people that you're leading? Because those symptoms are there. When I reflect and I think about those symptoms today, they were absolutely there prior to me having my panic attack. We taught line managers how to deal with somebody who in your team might present with depression or anxiety. What's your role as a line manager? Because you're not a psychiatrist. You're not a psychotherapist, but you have a critical role to play as a line manager to give that person support and love so that they can get better. But you can't give that empathy and that sympathy and that support and love if you don't understand what is depression and anxiety. And then finally what we did was we helped teach line managers how do you bring somebody back to work, reintegrate them back into work so that that is part of their recovery. You know, I was probably only 70% better when I went back to work. But if you saw me, you would have thought I was 100% better. But I wasn't. The only problem is I didn't go back to work with a plaster cast on my leg. If I'd gone back to work with a plaster cast on my leg, none of you would have asked me to go and get you a cup of coffee. And so therefore, how do you bring somebody back into work who's suffering, still suffering, probably 70 or 80% better, but wants to go back as part of their recovery? That reintegration is absolutely critical so as to prevent that person from relapsing. And so, over a period of about 8 months, we ran all these education programs. And the second thing that we did which had such an impact on the organization and breaking the stigma, was every quarter we campaigned around depression and anxiety. And I remember our first campaign. It was called, "How are you? ... Really." And with that campaign, with those campaigns internally, with the help of Time to Change and all the material that Time to Change and the assets that they have, we ran these campaigns. And with those campaigns, we did something which I'm so proud of. And that was, guess what happened when I came out of the closet? Others came out of the closet too. And so what we were able to do was we were able to film role models in our business. And these didn't have to be senior people. These were people who were influential, who were role models, but who all had had some sort of experience with depression or anxiety. And maybe they hadn't been ill themselves, but they were living with a partner who had depression. Or they had a daughter who suffered from general anxiety disorder. And when those stories were told, guess what? People in the business thought influential and senior people will understand if I put my hand up and ask for help. And it often flabbergasts me today when I talk to senior people and ask them to be a bit vulnerable about this. It flabbergasts me because I do not think that there's a single person in this country at a senior level who has not been touched by depression or anxiety. They've either got a brother, a sister, an aunt, an uncle, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter who's been touched. And I bet you that every single one of those senior people have given those individuals all the love and the support for those people to get better. Why can't they do that to their employees? The people who determine their success. And so, after seeing the success of that program within the organization, we saw something between a 6- and 8-fold increase in the number of people putting their hands up for help. I decided that I wanted to go out into the world and support and help organizations to, one, clearly develop a strategic framework around which one addresses mental health in an organization. And then offer those organizations some of the training and some of the development that is needed to raise the awareness and enhance the education of people in the corporate world around depression and anxiety. I'll never forget Alistair Campbell saying to me, "You know, Geoff, you've had 24 years in an organization, or 23 at the time, or whatever it was. You're a senior guy and you've had lived experience of this. How dare you not go and help address this in the corporate world?" And you know, in many ways, when I go into corporates today, and now I'm going to end, one of the most limiting factors that I see in the working world today is not the quality of people. It's not the financial resources that are available. It's not the quality of the brands or the product or the service. It's the energy of people. People have lost energy. They can't wait for a Friday afternoon when it's going to be a weekend. It's an indictment on the working world. They've lost energy. And the only way we can lead and give energy to organizations and to people is if we've got energy ourselves. And the only way we can manage our own energy is if we look after our well-being. We look after our well-being at a physical level, at an emotional level, at a mental level, and at a level of meaning. Answering the question that Mark Twain once quoted, what are the 2 most important days in your life? The day you were born and the day you find out why you were born. Thank you.